And for our second act of the night, we're going to have a panel discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to this. It's going to be moderated by my very good friend and fellow dean, Dari Mozaffarian, who is right over here, and it'll include both Professor Jacobson and Professor Maxwell. I do want to say, Dari, it's an honor to have you here in the house at Fletcher. Dr. Mozaffarian is not only himself a cardiologist and epidemiologist, but has devoted himself to nutrition and understanding the impact of how that can affect human security, human life, and human quality. He has published over, I had to triple check this number, 300 scientific publications, and does advisory work for the American Heart Association, the World Health Organization, the UN Food Commission. He is, in every sense, a global expert. Whenever I eat a meal around Dari, I get a little nervous, but because he's my friend, he forgives me my flaws and vices. Welcome to the stage, Professor Dr. Mozaffarian.
Me?
So it's really an honor to be here. I'm triply honored. I'm honored as the fourth dean of the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy, which was founded 40 years ago. This is our 40th anniversary next year by Jean Mayer and his good friend and co-conspirator who helped him support this, Henry Leir. I'm honored to be here because of the vision of the Leir Foundation now to support this new Institute for Human Security. I think it's remarkable in many ways, but what's particularly remarkable is the way it brings together these two phenomenal sister schools, the Fletcher School and the Friedman School. They're both remarkable schools in their vision for influencing the world and having outward translation. Sort of the opposite, as I mentioned in an earlier reception, of the ivory tower approach to academics. It's really about deconstructing science, coming up with the answers, training future leaders, and going out and really making a difference. And so to bring these two schools together in a new Institute for Human Security that covers food, humanitarian crisis, global migration, all of the major challenges is remarkable. And lastly, I'm honored to be here with two amazing faculty members that I've known since I've been at Tufts. One who is now officially at Fletcher and one who is now officially at the Friedman School, but both of whom throughout their careers here have lived in both worlds, equally moving back and forth between nutrition and security. So thank you so much. So I want to talk to them and let them tell you a little bit about their own work. The professorships that support them were really constructed and crafted to bring and retain and help support the careers of world-class scholars who have extensive experience in field research, in translation of knowledge, and who can mentor and develop future leaders in their respective fields. So I'd like to start off by asking each of you to talk about what you see in your own field as some of the key challenges we're facing in the world, and how as part of your work with your new chairs, you'd like to direct the focus of your work in your research and teaching to address these challenges. And Karen, we'll start with you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dari. It's a great pleasure to be here and a very, very tough act to follow to Ring's wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for that. It's really an honor to be here and a great pleasure to be here today. And thanks to the Leir Foundation for this wonderful opportunity. I just will talk a little bit about my work. I've been in this field of global migration, particularly forced migration, for a very long time. Some of you weren't even born when I started this work. So, I began, my interest in this field began with forced migration, and particularly focusing on the refugees and internally displaced people of Africa and the Middle East and Asia and so forth. But in the past year, since our most recent election, as a matter of fact, I have felt that it's very important to not just focus on what's happening in other countries, but to look at how the problems of migration, and which I'll talk about in a minute, but how those problems have really manifest themselves on our shores in the same way that many migration problems bridge, as Srin was talking about, bridge the worlds of poor, less developed countries and the rich north. So I want to just say three things about what I consider to be important in this field today. The first thing is that when we think about migration today, we often think about the migration crisis. And people talk about the crisis of all these Syrian refugees going to Europe. What I think is really important, and what I would like to, in my work I'm trying to address, is for people to understand that the migration crisis, number one, is not really a crisis. Europe has faced much larger numbers of refugees, even in recent years. After the wars in Yugoslavia, for example, many more refugees were appearing in Europe. But more importantly, that migration is not just about emergency flows of people. This is a long-standing part of our history. And because the world's population has grown, as we know, the percentage of people who are migrating, who are crossing borders, this percentage has not changed very much. 100 years ago, the percentage of the world's population that was migrating was around 2.9%. Today, that percentage is 3.3%. Very small number of people of the world's population are, a very small percentage are migrating, but of course, that means it's about 240 million people are living in countries not of their birth today. So it's not just a matter of the million or so refugees that have come to Europe. It's a matter of not only refugees, but many other migrants who have moved, often for the same reasons that refugees have moved. So it's not just about a migration crisis that's happening in Europe. Migration is affecting our entire globe. So what does this mean for us? To me, the most important problem that it presents, that migration presents for us, is not how to stop it, which is often how the European and other governments what they're focused on, is how to stop this migration. Nobody's going to stop migration. Migration is like a wave. We will never stop the waves that come. Obviously, what needs to happen is how we can absorb migration, how we can make migration a phenomenon that benefits everybody, that builds peace, that builds economic and political and social development, and where we can benefit from the opportunities that migration presents to us. One of the biggest challenges that migration, both in Europe and here in the US, is facing is the problem of integration. How are we going to find a way to integrate the people who come across our borders? And to me, this is a long-standing issue that's been quite well researched, and there's a lot of scholarship on it. But we need to really tackle this problem. And we need to understand much better how integration works and what inhibits it. And one of the research projects that I've been very focused on in this past year, and I see many of my students and my people who are working on this, is the problem of what happens when refugees come to cities. Urban migration is what migration is about now. Relatively few people go from rural areas to other rural areas. They go from rural areas to urban areas within their countries and into other countries. And in our own country, here in the US, people are moving across borders into the cities and towns of our country. And we need to understand how integration is happening in those towns and cities. And I want to put in a little plug for my project, for our project, the Refugees in Towns project, which the Leir Foundation has funded phenomenally. They've given us a wonderful grant to support the research on this. And I really want to to acknowledge and thank, again, the Leir Foundation for doing that. So I'll stop there, but I'm very looking forward to any questions that come afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and I'll have a follow-up question, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. So, Dan, the same question to you. What are some of the key challenges you think we're facing in the area of food security, and how would you like to direct the focus of your chair to address these challenges in your research and your teaching?
Thank you, Dari. And let me also echo Karen's appreciation for the previous speaker and also the generosity of the Henry J. Leir Foundation. My professorship is in food security, which is a kind of a technical term, but it broadly relates to the issue of hunger, of people not having access to adequate food, which is more or less what I have devoted my life's work to. I now work at the Feinstein International Center, which is a research institute dedicated to study of populations caught in crisis or at risk of some kind of humanitarian emergency. So my work focuses mostly on food security crises and in the worst case scenario on famines. We have been tracking global progress towards overcoming hunger for about the last 30 years, and broadly speaking have been making slow but reasonable progress towards overcoming hunger globally, from something like 1 billion people in 1990 to a little under 800 million people in 2015. At the same time, we know that 70 million people lost their lives in famines during the 20th century. But at the end of the 20th century, famines kind of disappeared, and some of us thought maybe they were actually a thing of the past. But famines re-emerged with the vengeance in 2011. 250,000 people lost their lives in a famine in Somalia. And we're now at a place where we have 4 countries at risk, at immediate current risk of falling back into famine, and at least 2 documented famines that have occurred in the past year. So the challenge that I would like to address my chair to with the support of the Leir Foundation is this question of why have famines re-emerged in the 21st century after we thought they were something of the past? And how does that relate to the fact that, by and large, we have been overcoming hunger, but suddenly now are faced with the reemergence of this phenomenon of famine? That kind of brings to mind 3 key issues, or 3 key points that I would like us to think about. The first one is the relationship between conflict and famine. The 4 countries that are at risk of famine right now are Somalia, South Sudan, Nigeria, and Yemen. And the clear factor that all of those countries have in common is that they're all in conflict. Somalia and Nigeria have an internal insurgency involving armed non-state actors that have been labeled as terrorists by the international community. And this affects not only the ability of outside humanitarian actors to access people in need, it also often traps people in situations of conflict, uses them as human shields, and does not allow them to get the help that they need either. South Sudan is in the middle of a nasty civil war. It's not been labeled as, none of the belligerents have been labeled as terrorists, but I dare say people are as terrified in South Sudan as they are in Somalia and Nigeria. And in many ways, Yemen is kind of the wild card. It's a country in which 2/3 of the population is at immediate risk of falling into famine. And this is out of a population of nearly 30 million people. So we're talking about something like 18 million people at risk in Yemen, which is involved in a war that involves not only local issues, but also a regional power struggle and sectarian overtones, as well as superpower engagement. So on the one hand, if conflict is the common factor across all of these, we have to think about the issues of conflict resolution, or at least conflict management, as a key component of dealing with famine, not simply dealing with the nutrition or the food security elements of it, but a much broader approach to it. We also have to think about, though, how long these kinds of crises last, and think about not only working on conflict, but working in conflict. What do we do to make sure that people, even caught in conflict, have access to adequate food, have access to the kind of healthcare or water or shelter, or indeed protection from human rights violations that people need and deserve. One of the subtitles of a recent book that we did on Somalia was about competing imperatives, and we have observed time and again that when you have a security imperative and a humanitarian imperative, the humanitarian imperative rarely trumps the security imperative. Security concerns will always override concerns about famine or about access to food. So if we're going to, if we recognize that these situations are protracted and long-lasting, we need to think better about how we work in those situations. And that may mean more emphasis on humanitarian protection. It may mean more emphasis on international humanitarian law, et cetera. The second challenge around this is the link between chronic hunger and famines. And as I mentioned, we've been making progress, at least until quite recently, on the issue of chronic hunger. Often when I'm asked to talk about famines, afterward people will come up to me and talk about things like improved agriculture or better production technologies, maybe even genetically modified foods, or empowering women, farmers, or starting savings and loans groups. All good things to do and all address the problem of chronic hunger, but they don't necessarily address the problem of famine. One of the things that we've tried to do recently and put a lot of effort into in the Feinstein Center is understanding how at-risk communities can become more resilient, more able to withstand shocks and better able to recover on their own or with minimal assistance from outside. And that's what's really different about attacking chronic hunger versus trying to prevent people from falling into famine. There's quite an agenda around this. Much of it focuses on sort of natural hazards like drought or environmental kinds of hazards or even economic hazards. But we're not as good at focusing on political hazards or conflict. And that kind of brings me to my third and last point, which is about the politics of famine. The other subtitle of our book on the Somalia famine was about collective failures. And we have got to take a much more holistic view of crises, be they famines or with other manifestations of human deprivation, to get away from our rather narrow focus on technical issues and think much more broadly about the politics of these things. No government, no controlling authority wants to be labeled as having been at the, on their watch have a famine. And as a result, it becomes very difficult to access people in famine. It becomes very difficult to talk about famine. It's become very difficult to analyze critically the factors that drive famine. And it's been a challenge to conduct research into these circumstances. So I think the combination of those things lays out a fairly ambitious research agenda. And once again, I would like to thank the Leir Foundation for their generous support of our efforts in this field.
So I think from both of those initial responses, it's pretty clear what the synergies can be in an Institute for Human Security that brings together these fields. And so we want to leave some time for questions. So I'll ask you a follow-up question and just give a more brief answer, maybe a couple of minutes, to follow up on that. So given what you've discussed, and Dan, we'll start with you and then go back to Karen. Given what you've discussed, what are the synergies that you see for future achievement in scholarship or teaching or impact that can occur across, for example, the 4 chairs that are now endowed and the Institute for Human Security? Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, if you think about the things I just said, I mentioned conflict resolution, I mentioned respect for the rule of law, I mentioned factors around economic development, I mentioned respect for human rights, and I mentioned humanitarian access and humanitarian action. And those pretty much define the core fields that the Institute for Human Security embraces, teaches in, and conducts research on. So I think intellectually, the overlap is ripe for all kinds of synergy and all kinds of collaboration. I do think that the other thing that the chairs will enable us to do, and I say this speaking as someone who has worked for 11 years in a soft-funded research institute, we are often chasing one grant, finishing up the work from another grant, thinking of upcoming ones, trying to make sure that the ones that have are complete, get into the public discourse, into the public domain, into the hands of policymakers and so forth. And we often don't have the time that it takes to do that kind of second level of synthesis or of teamwork or thinking through complex problems, not just from the perspective of famines or from the perspective of forced migration, which have obvious overlaps, but on a much broader level. And one of my hopes for these chairs is that not only the chair holders, but the entire community of scholars around these two schools can work together to not only address some of these core research questions, but also that sort of second level of synthesis of thinking about how do these things interact, how do we get smarter about addressing problems holistically, and how can that be done from a sort of a perspective of both being a scholar and a practitioner.
Thank you very much. Karen?
Well, to me, the whole idea of endowing a chair is, to me, like it's this amazing, almost medieval phenomenon that still exists today. What could be more incredible than to have an endowed chair? I mean, every day I get up and think to myself, I have an endowed chair, and it means I can just relax, you know? I mean, and you can focus on your students, you can focus on your thinking big thoughts and figuring out how to bring people together and how to talk to people. It's just, I mean, I've been in the Feinstein Center for, I don't know, 20 years, and it was always about chasing grants. It's just phenomenal not to have to do that anymore. Thank you, Leir. Thank you so much. And it also means that we can focus on our students. I mean, this is the reason all of us faculty are here at Fletcher and at Friedman, because of our phenomenal students. I mean, Tsering is just one little example of how amazing our students are. And we can really focus on students now, as all the faculty sitting here know. This is what it gives us, is to be able to do this. And the synergy that you talk about, Dan, it all just comes out of being able to relax and focus on what's important now. So to me, it's a gift. I feel completely blessed. It's not the language I usually talk about, but since I've had Tsering for the past few days, I do indeed feel very blessed that I've done this, and I just want to thank the Leir Foundation again.
Well, we'll open it up for questions. I think we can, summarize the concepts that people have discussed about these incredible interlinkages of what human security is, and human security is internal peace. Human security is freedom from food insecurity. Human security is well-being and freedom from conflict. And one thing that I think is amazing too is that food security is defined as the availability not just of food, but the availability of nutritious, affordable food. And so there are probably 250 of 300 million Americans who are in food insecurity, because it's not just those who are hungry, but it's those who are getting disease from lack of access to affordable, nutritious food. And so that's true globally. And so thinking about human security and the Fletcher School's strengths and the problems facing the world, it goes beyond hunger to many, many other aspects. So I think it's really, again, remarkable that the Leir Institute, the Leir Foundation has brought together the Friedman and the Fletcher School formally this way. So we have time for a few minutes for questions from the audience. Please just identify yourself, your name and your rank and serial number if you're in the military, but otherwise your name and your affiliation and your question. And please keep your questions brief as well so we have time.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation on all parts. And thank you again to Tsering for kicking it off with her fabulous presentation. Joyce Barsom, I'm on the Board of Advisors of the Fletcher School. The situation that came to my mind immediately when both of you spoke was the flight of the Rohingya from their homeland across borders in terrible conditions of lack of human security, lack of food. Is this chair interested in addressing that kind of situation? And what would be your recommended first, second, third steps for alleviation of their misery?
Yeah, the Rohingya have been a problem. Well, they're not a problem, but but Burma or Myanmar has been trying to deal with the problem of what they consider to be the problem of the Rohingya for many years. It has flared up into a crisis situation now, but the Rohingya have been fleeing and being displaced and as part of an upheaval in Myanmar for many decades. In fact, this is a very good example of how the crisis that we're seeing now is just part of an ongoing problem. The Rohingya have been living in the camps of Bangladesh in Cox's Bazar, in this area in Bangladesh bordering Myanmar, for decades. They're also the people who flee in boats across the Indian Ocean toward toward Australia and other places. And it's a very good example of how displacement that occurs affects the whole world. We're seeing it now. It's coming to sort of this, it's being sort of talked about a lot in the media now, and also because other countries in the Middle East are weighing in, because this is a Muslim minority group in Myanmar that have been displaced. But yes, of course, what I think one of the things the chair should do is to kind of try to put some of these crises, these migration crises, into the broader historical context of what is happening, so that people can understand why it is that suddenly we're hearing about the Rohingya where most people never heard about them before. To try to understand how this is part of long tropes and sweeps of history that have been going on for a long time. And what we're seeing now is just that the media has suddenly caught hold of it, not that it's a new piece. So I totally agree that these are exactly the kind of things that both chairs, will do, is look at these crises and try to put them in the broader context so we understand them better.
Please, yes.
Thank you. My name is Catherine Koch, and I am here as a friend of Tsering. When I was in the Foreign Service doing regional environmental work in South Asia, my conclusion after 3 years was the core, and I believe it's true in the United States, not just South Asia, the core environmental problem is population growth. That may be a bit radical in a wrong way, but I wondered how population growth figures into the two subjects that you're going to both be addressing, and how you might address that.
Dan, do you want to take that one?
Sure. One of the most enduring interpretations of famine came to us from Malthus, who hypothesized that human populations grew at a geometric rate and agricultural technology improved at a sort of a more arithmetic rate, and that sooner or later a population would outgrow our ability to produce food, and therefore some people would have to starve. And that in a way, systemically looking, that was a good thing because it was sort of a positive check on runaway population growth. That explanation, that understanding of famine has stuck with us for about 200 years. It was finally debunked by Professor Amartya Sen, who now is across the river here, or not, actually on our side of the river in Cambridge, at Harvard. And what he pointed out was that the issue of famine is not that there is not enough food for people. The issue is that some people do not have access to adequate food. Now, the people who think about these issues globally are worried that with population growth being what it is, we need to continue to innovate and develop new agricultural technologies. We need to think of better, more environmentally sustainable ways of producing food for a growing population, et cetera. But population growth isn't the reason that we have famines. The reason we have famines is because for one reason or another, a whole group of people suddenly, or over a period of time, lose their ability to access adequate food. So there's usually an economic aspect to it, there's usually a political aspect to it, and sometimes it's done deliberately. Sometimes food is used as a weapon of war, or sometimes people are deliberately denied access to adequate food. So again, this is a little bit the reason that I brought up the issue about chronic hunger on the one hand, vis-a-vis famine as a particular extreme case of food insecurity, because they actually have rather different causes, even if some of the things that we do to address chronic hunger, if done well, will help us overcome famine.
Would it be fair to say that compared to the sweep of history, looking back, millennia, that in some ways conflicts and famines and displacements relative to the proportion of the world population may be actually even better, and we may be improving. They're more obvious and they're more tragic and they're more terrible because we know how to address them, but actually as population has grown and technology has grown, maybe we're better off than 1,000 years ago. And if so, I mean, that's actually a positive message that academic institutions can continue to improve that knowledge. Is that a fair non-expert assessment, or no, are things worse now than they've ever been?
I'm wondering if Alex Duvall is in the house tonight. I mean, he has looked at this question over history, and has shown that in the 20th century, something like 70 million people lost their lives, and we have data on that. In the 19th and 18th centuries, we know of massive famines, but we don't have a good idea of the mortality in those crises. So yes, it is fair to say that for the most part we are better off now. I mentioned at the beginning that we're tracking the extent to which we're overcoming global hunger, and the numbers have only dropped rather modestly from around 1 billion to something like 800 million today. But given population growth, the proportion of the population living in chronic hunger has dropped, considerably more than that, from like 18% in 1990 to about 11% today. So yes, your observation is broadly correct.
That's positive in a discussion of really tragic events. We're maybe moving in a positive direction. Maybe we can have one last question. Was there one last question? Did you have one?
Thanks. I'm Kim Wilson, and I know Karen and Dan well. I teach here at Fletcher. And my question is, I think you've articulated how famine can drive migration. But maybe explain to those of us that don't study migration or hunger how migration actually can drive famine, if there's a link that goes in that direction.
Do you want to address that, or do you want me to?
How migration can drive famine. I guess it could. I guess we don't usually think about it quite in those ways.
Well, for example, I mean, there definitely are causal linkages in both directions, which is an example of the kinds of synergy that we could think about with these shares. I mean, the Rohingya, someone mentioned, is a good example. They have been forcibly displaced from their place of origin. They're displaced from their livelihoods. They're displaced from their usual ability to earn or to produce the food that they need to survive. So in that sense, the forced migration has forced I mean, they're not in famine, but they are in urgent need of external food assistance. So in that sense, the forced displacement is what's driving the food security problem. On the other hand, the example that we saw in Somalia in 2011, people were trying to hold on their, to the extent that it was an agricultural population that was caught in it, trying to stay on their land, hoping that the rains would fall again quickly enough that they could survive a bad year. And it was when the rains failed for the second time, and it was clear that they were not going to make it through to another harvest. Their livestock were dying. In that case, it was the famine that drove the migration, and you saw widespread movement to both Kenya and Ethiopia, and internally in Somalia to urban centers where people might seek casual employment or other means of supporting themselves. So I think that there are the causal arrows in that case, if you will, run both ways depending on the nature of the crisis.
Yeah, I would perhaps argue with you a little on that, because I think that migration is a survival, for the most part, a survival strategy. And when people don't flee, when people migrate, it isn't going to cause migration, famine.
The forced migration in this case.
Yeah, but even anybody's migration, it's more likely it's going to alleviate the strain of not having access to enough food on the people who are behind. Just to get back to this issue of overpopulation, it's very old-fashioned and even some may say regressive thing to say, but in my own view, I do think that overpopulation is a problem today. I think it's very difficult for any of us to say, there's no problem here when it comes to the fact that there are just too many human beings on this earth. Now, the fact of the matter is that the problem is that there are too many human beings in some parts of the earth, that there are too many people moving into some areas that cannot support them, or are living in some areas that cannot support them and therefore have to migrate. But I don't think it's okay to say we can just keep breeding at this phenomenal rate that we are, and destroying our environment, wiping out our wildlife and our ecosystems, and just say it's fine because we've got some technological solution that's coming our way. Maybe if we'll, migrate off to Mars, that would solve the problem. But I don't think that's happening, and I do think we need to stop breeding.
I hope you don't think that's what I was saying.
I'm sure it wasn't, but it's...
So no, I think this demonstrates for the students in the room the lively and important insights, and for the non-students in the room, I think people want to come back to school, right, to hear some of these conversations. And I think that the next institute should be an institute for planetary health, because that is a major topic of interest at Tufts, to think about health of the planet, which means not just the health of the people, but health of the animals, health of the entire planet. And last, I'll take 1 minute, because I noticed from the program that no one has introduced and thanked and honored Admiral Stavridis. So he has opened and is closing the program, and he's not one to sing his own praises. And so I just want to say that as someone who came in about a year after he started, I am unbelievably honored even to be in the same sentence as a peer of someone like Admiral Stavridis, who is incredibly down to earth, incredibly brilliant, incredibly committed to what he's doing. And from what he said one time at a meeting, working harder now as Dean of the Fletcher School than he ever worked as NATO Supreme Allied Commander. So I really thank him for hosting this. Yeah.
Thank you. Very nice. Thank you.